The Johnson Wax Program with Fibber McGee and Molly.
And now, get ready to smile again with radio's home folks, They Can Sade, written by Paul Reimer.
The story of Mert and Marge.
It's Adventure Time with Orphan Annie.
She and Sandy make a pair. They never seem to have a care. Cute little she, this little Orphan Annie.
People are always interested in the past. Some people study it diligently through the history books. Other people remember it. Some people are interested in ancient history or American history, and others are interested in really contemporary history. There are a lot of folks who just today can learn about the recent past by listening to vintage radio programs that their parents listened to. And indeed, the parents themselves can remember listening to programs when they were a child. And so there's always a fascination with what has gone before. And while the past is a nice place to visit, you wouldn't want to live there. But nevertheless, there's some fascinating things you can learn while you're enjoying the radio shows. I love the radio broadcast. I enjoy listening to them. I enjoy sharing those programs with the listeners. I enjoy planning the material, and I love to broadcast the material. But if the material wasn't any good in the first place, it never would have lasted for 22 years.
I'll take it back to things I remember when I was about 6 years old, and how I really probably got started toward wanting to go into radio. I listened to Orphan Annie. I mean, I was just devoted to Orphan Annie. And I'd come home from school, or if I were, not going to school, and just every day just meant so much to me.
My parents thought I could perform, and so at a very young age, there was a Friday night program on WENR at Kimball Hall with Everett Mitchell and Irma Glenn, who played the big council organ. And I used to do little ditties and sing songs and this kind of thing. And I did this for quite some time, close to a year. At the age of 7, there was a group formed at WGN called the WGN Players. And they wanted to have a child as part of the cast. And you needed a lot of versatility in those days, I guess, or they were willing to settle for less, perhaps. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, they had heard about me, and I became the child of the cast, and this lasted for 3 years. There was no professional pool of talent in those days. I was away from radio at that point of time. I had about a 6-month break, so to speak, before I went in and tried out for Annie. Being in school, I would rush from school, hop on the streetcar, run down to the merchandise mart, because even though the show was aired on WGN, we worked out of the NBC studios. And this became my way of life for 5 days a week for 9.5 years. Our original writer was a man named Frank Dahm, and he wrote for a number of years. Very little in the format changed over the years, but the adventures were worldwide, everything from Simmons Corners with Annie living on the farm with Mr. and Mrs. Silo and her friend Joe, who lived nearby, and then traveled everywhere, especially if Daddy Warbuck showed up and took her with him on his adventures. Oh, the cast they were wonderful people. Mrs. Silo was played by Henrietta Tedrow. Now, all the people I'm mentioning are people who were in theater, and theater started to become very slow, and so all these experienced people transferred to radio. Then, of course, Sandy. Well, with Sandy, he was broken down into 3 parts. Somebody would growl, somebody would bark, and I did his whining and crying. So that As an example, when Annie was situated in a very tense situation, and she was talking to Sandy in a very quiet voice, and then Sandy would have to talk back to her. So here was I, whining to myself and talking back to Sandy, this kind of thing. This could go on for 2 pages of script.
Well, radio was a major part of Chicago in the early days of broadcasting. So many of the programs, the major network programs, came out of Chicago. Fibber McGee and Molly, Amos and Andy, The Breakfast Club, the after-school adventure shows, Jack Armstrong, Little Orphan Annie, Captain Midnight, and the daytime soap operas, Ma Perkins. Many programs like that all originated in Chicago. And then as the years grew on, as we moved into the late 30s, early 40s, then the advertising agency people were centering on the East Coast and on the West Coast. Radio performers found that they had additional means of employment besides radio on the East Coast in the Broadway stage and on the West Coast in the silver screen. And so they were moving in both directions and away from the Midwest. This is not new. It happened in the movies. Chicago was a center for motion pictures way back in the real early days of movies. And then eventually, well, they didn't go too much to New York, which was also a minor center for movie making. They followed the sun and went to California, where instead of shooting outdoors 4 or 5 or 6 months a year in Chicago, they could shoot outdoors virtually 12 months a year. So that's what happened to Chicago radio. And then it happened again with Chicago television. TV in Chicago, it was big in the beginning. It was a center, especially before they started using tape and film. They did the show in Chicago, and it was done once, and it was reached on both the coasts. Chicago was the mecca for radio. If you were on radio in Chicago in the late 20s and early 30s, you were in big-time radio.
I think it was Jack Armstrong that was having some kind of contest, how you could make the most words out of Butterfinger. And whoever would win it would win a giant package of Butterfingers, and their name would be announced on the air. Well, I must admit that though my mother submitted my name, she had this giant dictionary, you know, this Webster or whatever, and she got all these names out of it, numbers out of it, and words. And all of a sudden, one night I'm listening to the radio, and there they said that I won. I wanted to be a reporter, and I wanted to be an actress, and I thought the first job I get in either one of the fields, I'm just going to be, you know. So I couldn't make any kind of headway at the Daily News, where I was friends with some of the cover reporters, but the editorial guys didn't want to hire me for some reason. But I met, I went down to NBC for an audition and got the part, and it was on a network drama. It was on every week. I think it was Authors. It was either Authors Playhouse or Escape. No, Authors Playhouse. Mm-hmm. That's what it was. And then, you know, that at that time, as your other guests will tell you, it almost became a family, because when you worked at NBC, other directors called you there too, so you did other shows, and then you went to CBS and pretty much worked with everybody, the same people. And then, so I was on my way. I was still at school, Northwestern. But then, what probably was the biggest break came when, through a fluke, I finally met Jack LaFrandre, who was the director of my favorite program, Chicago Theater of the Year. No one ever seemed to be able to meet him. I walk into WGN, and I'm sitting there with some of my friends that are waiting around for directors to come in, and there comes this man, and someone says, "There's Jack LaFrandre." Jack LaFrandre. So he was the director, and I raced up to him. And I said, "Mr. LaFrandre, blah, 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 I want to get a job on your program." He stared at me, looked me up and down. You're like, "Is this real?" You know? And then he said, "I have an idea, come in with me." So he brought me into the studio, gave me a script, The Chocolate Soldier, and he had me read it, and then he said, from the control room, "All right, Friday, you'll be here at blah, 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 and Saturday is the dress rehearsal, and the show is Saturday night." And I had a small, it's a second lead. Well, I couldn't believe it, you know. So I came, and Marion Clare was the star of the show, you know, the singing star, and Lorette was the woman who had played most of the dramatic leads. So when I did the show, he came over to me. No, he said, I want to call you up in a couple of days. And everybody was very nice to me, you know. And he called me up and he said, you're going to be in Carmen next week, and you're going to play Carmen, but I want you to come down because we want to sign you to a contract. Well, after I picked myself up off, you know, the faint, that's how everything went. And he gave me, from then I was playing the leads.
We came here in 1924, and in 1928, I played the harmonica on WWAE in the old, well, in the present Supreme Liberty Life building on 35th and King Drive. Being a young fella then, and there were others, we were hoping that we would be able to, you know, and see other blacks on it, but there just were no blacks on there. There was Amos and Andy, and my mother and my brother and sister and I were living with my grandparents, and it was against the law of that family to turn on Amos and Andy. There were many bands, black bands, musicians. Louis Armstrong, we would listen to him, Fletcher Henderson, and Orlando Robeson. They would come on, I think it was about twice a week. They didn't have the hour shows then. I don't even believe they were half-hour shows. I think they were on for about 15 minutes. And they came, it was piped into Chicago and across the country by, I would imagine, the towers that they had, telephone wires. And of course, we had a local man here by the name of Father Hines. He was well known, and he would play on, this was in the early 30s. Before that was Jack L. Cooper, and he had something like 40 hours, but it was spread out over many of the small stations, and he resold that to different churches and to different people. And Al Benson, as I stated earlier, he would have other disc jockeys who would come in and buy time from him, so he was making it twice, and he was about the best known of it. Getting back to the early people, there was Lucky Cordell, who had a jazz show, but over in Gary. Then he came to Chicago to one of the stations, probably, I don't recall, but I think it was WGES was the only radio station that I can recall that had blacks. And then there was WSBC that had a few. They were on part-time. And then in 1959, my partner here, Purvis Spann, became the blues man at WOPA here in Chicago. And he's been playing the blues ever since.
The number one contribution, I think, that Chicago makes to American broadcasting is the soap opera. The soap opera is really born and bred in this city. Two of the three major production personalities for the genre come out of Chicago, particularly Erna Phillips, who was from Chicago, went to the University of Wisconsin, University of Illinois, was at Northwestern for a while, even teaching classes. She develops the genre first in 1931 with Painted Dreams on WGN, in which she not only writes, but she also appears as one of the characters. It's a story of a struggling Irish family, and then she moved it over to one of the major networks, NBC, I believe, with changing the names to create a new soap opera about a struggling Irish family again. And it really, its popularity 5 times a week, selling household type products to a primarily female listening audience. This is perfect for advertisers, and soon we find by the middle 30s that soap operas are everywhere. Many of them produced in Chicago, but also coming out of New York City. Soap operas are entertaining the daytime audiences of America. Again, an invention of Chicago. Paul Reimer is from Bloomington, Illinois, and his program, Vic and Sade, which starts about 1932 and ran till 44, was off the air and came back then as a half-hour sitcom and didn't have it as a half-hour sitcom. His daily exploits of the, or shenanigans, I should say, of the Vic and Sade, the Gook family, and their relatives, particularly Uncle Fletcher, brought you a slice of sort of Americana, small-town Americana that I think is comparable to Mark Twain. Unfortunately, he wrote it for radio, and radio is, you know, except for wonderful things such as you're doing here, is a pretty much forgotten medium as a storytelling entity. But there were at work in the medium and very bright and creative men and women. And Paul Reimer is one of the brightest, I think, and his wit is laden with irony and punnery and just this perfect understanding of the quaintness of people. There are only 4 people who show up in the program, and they don't even show up in every one. But just the weight of the personality, and above all, the charm of the writing carried that for well over a decade.
When I was 13 years old, I got started in radio, and I wanted to prove something to myself and my friends and my parents that I could accomplish something. I had never really gotten a passing grade in school, and I was given a crystal set when I was 9 or 10 years old, and then a radio, and became interested in listening to personalities, and became a great friend of Russ Winnie, who was at WTMJ in Milwaukee at the time. And he sort of nurtured me and got me interested to even a greater extent. And they had some local soap operas, and I ended up playing kids' parts and also do sound effects. I did a real good St. Bernard dog. I could really imitate him doing absolutely everything. I was rather successful as this child actor at age 13, and being a reasonable success at it, I wanted to do other. I remember my mother took me to the Wisconsin Theater for a concert of Paul Whiteman and his orchestra, and I announced to my mother on walking out of the theater, "Someday, Mother, I am going to be announcing that orchestra," and at the age of 19 I was out of Chicago for Chesterfield Cigarettes. Paul Whiteman show is very interesting because they produced it for radio like you'd produce a television show today. In other words, Mr. Whiteman wore a white full-dress suit. I wore a yellow full-dress suit. Roy Bargy, who did all the arrangements, played the piano and really directed the orchestra during the broadcast. Well, I announced everything Chicago and West, and they had another announcer who did it in New York and East. So I do 13 or 14 of them a year. I think I should tell you how I came to get into really big-time radio. There was a guy by the name of Bob Kaufman who was program director at CBS and WBBM in Chicago. And he arrived in Milwaukee and on the train, and there I was doing sort of a man-on-the-street broadcast from the station. And he thought I was fairly clever at that. And then 2 hours later, he walked down Wisconsin Avenue past the marquee of the Riverside Theater. And there I was doing another man on the street. And then he went to the Riverside Theater that evening and saw me emceeing an amateur show. Well, I got a letter from Bob about 3 weeks later. And I was making $50 a week, which was a fortune in those days. There were people putting kids through school on $6 a week. And he asked me if I'd come to Chicago. I said I would if he'd give me an extra couple of bucks a week. So I think I got $52 a week. Well, I lasted 2 weeks. I was 17 years old, and they had given me my pink slip. And 2 days before I was supposed to take the Sorai special back to Milwaukee, why, I was sitting in the announcer's lounge, and Marion Shepard, who was sort of in charge of all the announcers, she said, "Who's down in the announcer's lounge?" I said, "Tommy Bartlett." She said, "Well, you get your self over to 205 North Michigan. We're auditioning a thing called Meet the Misses from the Home Arts Guild. John Harrington, the famous announcer, is supposed to be doing it. And he hasn't showed up, and the client is waiting to hear this audition. Would you rush over and did it?" So I did it, and they sold it. This was a fun in the studio type thing, women who all knew each other. And Mr. Harrington started the show, very dear friend of mine. On the following Monday and on Tuesday, H.M. Alexander, the account executive with the advertising agency, he's the guy who thought up Ask the Man Who Owns One for Packard, When It Rains It Pours for Morton Salt. He said, we like Mr. Harrington very much, but we think we like that little fat red-headed kid from Milwaukee who did the surprise audition. Is there a chance that he can do the show? Well, I'd gone from $50 a week in Milwaukee to $52 a week in Chicago. And I said I'd need another $2.50 and I'd stay. I was doing a show for Harold Stokes, who was program director of ABC and WLS radio in Chicago. I did a replacement. Don McNeil used to do the Breakfast Club across the board Mondays through Saturdays, and he got tired of getting up Saturdays. So I had the Tommy Bartlett show, Wake Up and Smile, which replaced the Breakfast Club on Saturdays. Then I had another show, another Tommy Bartlett show, Mondays through Fridays on the ABC radio network, with Ralph Martiri's orchestra, the Honey Dreamers, a 30-piece live orchestra, very, very exciting. And this gentleman in New York decided that I might be a person who could appear for Procter & Gamble in a summer replacement for Cliff Arquette's Glamour Manor. Welcome Travelers had 9 years of NBC radio and 6 years of CBS television. And when it went off the air, it was at times the #1 daytime television show in the United States. That's at times. This hat was presented to me some 20 years ago at the Calgary Exhibition in Stampede, and I've emceed that for the past 25 years. And this hat, I had just got back from the Calgary Stampede doing the 26th show up there. And we were doing a rehearsal one time, and I saw this figure walking across the infield, and it was a man with a cane, and I immediately realized it was Mr. Godfrey. At CBS, we never called him Arthur. It was always Mr. Godfrey. And I'd never had the thrill or the pleasure of meeting Mr. Godfrey before. And he came and walked up on the stage, waited till that little bit that I was doing was over, and then came out. And he said, "You're Tommy Bartlett, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "And you're Mr. Godfrey." And he said, "I've always wanted to meet you because you're one of the few people who occasionally beat me in the daytime ratings." And I thought that was awful nice of him to come all the way across, especially when it was so difficult for him to walk and he needed the use of the cane.
Radio, as I presented on the air, is an acquired taste for someone who hasn't ever experienced it. When I first went on the air, I thought the only people who would be interested in listening to all of my stuff would be people who were around my age, who remembered it and had a fondness for it. My great delight in all of this has been the fact that there have been hundreds and hundreds, literally thousands of people over the years who have discovered radio as I present it, and they had never heard it before. So for a large segment of my audience, it's not nostalgia at all. It's something new, it's something different, it's something original. But I can never say, parents come to me and they say, my kids, they can't understand, they don't like this, they don't like the Shadow and Inner Sanctum, they can't get into Jack Benny and all that. And I said, well, what do you do? Well, I'd say, sit down and listen to this. I mean, they can't sit down and listen to it. They have to gain it by osmosis. They have to be attracted to it in some other way. And I say to parents, if you want your children to appreciate this, take some cassettes with you on a motor trip. And after you've listened to an hour's worth of the contemporary radio that the kids want to listen to, say, now it's my turn, and I want to listen to this. Now, either you have a four-door car and you have some kids in the back seat, a captive audience, and they may be madder than heck that they have to listen to this, but eventually they turn on to it. And some of those people who have found it that way have become the biggest fans of old-time radio. And when we talk about old-time radio, we're not talking necessarily about nostalgic radio. We're talking about radio as it was broadcast on the air in basically the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And if that material wasn't any good then, it wouldn't be any good now. I mean, if radio in the beginning, or in that golden age, was crummy, I could have had a show on the air for 6 months maybe saying, listen to what this was, and people would tune in and they'd hear one or two shows and they'd say, wow, that was pretty bad. Okay, that's what it was. I'm glad it isn't anymore. See? But there are some wonderful pockets of listeners who are 11 and 12 years old and 13. We find, over the years I have found now, that we can intrigue youngsters in their pre-teens until they get into high school, and they're dedicated to listening to the old-time radio shows. They've discovered something, they love it, they imitate the programs and all of this stuff. But when they get into high school, now there's a tremendous competition for their attention and a lot of peer pressure. You know, in a high school of 4,000 kids, maybe 3 of them are listening to old-time radio, and the rest of them haven't the slightest idea what it is. So during high school, and then into college a little bit, I lose them. But it's so wonderful, because sometimes in the middle of in the summertime, a college student will come up to me where I'm broadcasting, and he'll say, you know, I haven't listened to you the last few years, but I remember listening to you when I was just a little kid, and you know, in my 7th grade, and I'm back again, and I'm listening, and I've still got 2 years of college to go, but when I get done, you know, and I've also had people come to me with their wife and their child, and they say, I used to listen to you in the beginning. I've had 3 generations of listeners. In 22 years we get that.
Let me make it clear to you that the banks will take care of all needs, except, of course, the hysterical demands of hoarders. And it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime in every part of our nation.
Well, radio to me in the early days, especially in the 30s, the Depression days, was symbolized by the voice of Franklin D. Roosevelt and his fireside chats during the Depression. Nothing quite like it. There was magic to radio. I suppose my first memory of radio's big impact on me was the summer of 1924, the Democratic Convention. It won 104 ballots, 102 ballots, went on forever. And I was on vacation with my father and my brother, and we were at South Haven, and all the kids were out playing on the beach and in the sunshine, and I was in that big chair hearing that radio in a big, ugly, super heterodyne box, and it was the voices of the chairman of the Democratic Convention in New York. It was very hot, 104 ballots, and it was Al Smith versus William Gibbs McAdoo for the nomination. William Gibbs McAdoo was the nephew of Woodrow Wilson, the ex-president, and neither got it. There was a dead heat. They chose a man named John W. Davis, a Wall Street lawyer. But I'm in that chair hearing that voice of a man named Senator Tom Walsh, who was chairman of the convention. And the voice I most remember was the opening one for 103 ballots from Alabama. A man says, Alabama, 24 votes for Underwood. He was their favorite son. I have no idea what influence radio had in my life or career. I wasn't aware of any, but it was there with me when we had a crystal set in Chicago now, 1922, 23. Crystal set, which you have a little wire connects with crystal, and you may or may not get that station. The big station was KYW Chicago, KYW, and we'd hear that, and the voice was out of the announcer named Sen Caney, first announcer. But I remember best the song, sung by a red-headed music maker. He was called Wendell Hall, the red-headed music maker. Played ukulele. Ukulele was popular then, and he'd sing the song, "It ain't gonna rain no more, no more." You know, how in the heck you gonna wash your neck if it ain't gonna rain no more, no more? It ain't gonna rain. That was, and we all sang that song. We heard it on the radio. So it was an entertainment vehicle. At the same time, something was going on in the mind of a young kid, because they also broadcast the Scopes trial, Clarence Darrow versus William Jennings Bryan in Evolution in Tennessee. Hot day, and you hear once in a while a WGN did that.
Well, Chicago had, in terms of its comedy programming, Chicago was not the big splashy review type of comedy. It wasn't the home of Eddie Cantor. It wasn't the home of the Al Jolson radio shows. That was done primarily in New York and sometimes out of Hollywood, because this is where the major movie stars that are needed to keep a variety show going as guests would show up, and that's where they lived and worked. So you moved your facilities to their locality. Chicago's type of humor was more everyday life, middle America type. Lum and Abner, which was set in rural Arkansas, came out of Chicago. It was here, at least in the 1930s, till it eventually moved. But here for a good while, Lum and Abner ran the Jot 'em Down store, and it's sort of folksiness. Paul Reimer's Vic and Sade is the same thing. It's kind of a folksy quality, a serialized story that would go on 5 times a week. Not serialized, but a 5-time-a-week program, 15 minutes at a shot, like the Vic and the Lum and Abner. So this kind of humor is middle American. It doesn't have the flash and the glitz of the Hollywood and New York, the movie and Broadway types of productions. So I think above all, that's the importance of Chicago's contribution to comedy. In terms of soap operas, it's the same thing. The soap opera is the story of everyday people, or people who are everyday types who are in extraordinary situations. It might be Our Gal Sunday, who's married to a rich lord. It might be Mary Noble, backstage wife, who is just an average girl from Iowa, like you out in the listening audience, but she's married to Larry Noble, handsome matinee idol. And so you get, through vicarious identification, you get to follow along with what it would be like to be Cinderella, is basically what it is. These are Cinderella stories. Again, it's Chicago people who produced this. In terms of children's programming, and again we see the imprint, the impact really of Chicago on daytime radio. Much of the children's fare that we nostalgically remember, very warmly remember, came out of Chicago. A Little Orphan Annie was Chicago. Jack Armstrong was not only an all-American boy, he was a Chicago boy. Even though it was Hudson High that we waved the flag for, it could have been, Senn High School or one of the other ones here in Chicago, because it was a Chicago production. Don Winslow of the Navy was here in Chicago as well. I think it fit the time zone. The actors were here. These were consummate radio actors, but they didn't have the big flashy names that you identified with movie marquees. Again, that sort of unassuming yet extremely entertaining and very, very successful radio fare with a small town, middle American touch is Chicago's contribution. The Western isn't so much a Chicago production. The Western as a children's form certainly is the dominant mode in which we encounter it in radio. It doesn't become an adult form until radio is really on the way out, not until the early 50s with Gunsmoke and the Six Shooter and a few other network attempts at adult westerns do we find the Western anything but, Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, Shoot 'em Up, Sagebrush. Amos and Andy, of course, is a Chicago production. It was done by 2 minstrel show types who took their imitations of stereotypical imitations of African-American life, began on a local WEBH, Edgewater Beach Hotel station in 1924, moved in by 26 to the Chicago Tribune station, WGN, as Sam and Henry. The Tribune would run a couple times a week a cartoon of Sam and Henry that would parallel the radio show, and all again filled with the typical racist, I think, white stereotypes of black people. But then Amos and Andy came to, when the contract dispute, being what it was, forced Freeman Gauzen and Charles Correll out of WGN. They came to NBC in Chicago and changed the names of the characters to Amos and Andy, and basically continued on the same type of way, except this time, through the magic of syndication and network linkages, they became a national phenomenon, not just a WGN local phenomenon. And that really precipitated the mad rush toward radio. I think we can say that Amos and Andy took what was an interesting piece of equipment, the radio set of the 20s, and turned it into a necessity of life by the early 30s. Their radio programs were astronomical in terms of their ratings and the popularity. Much as we credit Milton Berle later for popularizing television, certainly Freeman Gauzet and Charles Correll with Amos and Andy did the same thing with radio 20, 30 years earlier. Jim and Marion Jordan, a young couple from Peoria, Illinois, had come to Chicago in the early 20s and had been fascinated with the new medium of radio and tried different formats, and by the late 1930s they hit upon Fibber McGee and Molly. And this characterization, which stayed in Chicago until I think about 1939 when they moved to Hollywood, was again within that kind of folksy, common person that was so famous in Chicago radio production. Fibber McGee is sort of, everybody knows this type, he's sort of a blowhard, he's a lovable blowhard who is never able to see himself quite as we, the realists in the audience, see him, and quite as his wife certainly could see him. Molly was able to always cut him down with her "tain't so McGee" type of phraseology. As she was the rationalist, and she was the one we could clearly identify with. And again, it has that kind of that quality that I was talking about earlier, where they're just average people. I mean, they're from Peoria. They bring their kind of personalities, their own backgrounds into this type of characterization.
My earliest memory of actual appearance was as a gangster, a Chicago gangster, because now that I was with this theater group, Chicago at that same time was one of the centers of radio soap operas. As much as New York, Chicago had Ma Perkins and Manhattan Mother and Betty and Bob and Guiding Light and First Nighter. They came out of Chicago live. And so someone said from the theater group I was with, why don't you audition? You got a gangster voice. And I auditioned, and my first role was in Ma Perkins. And I was the one who threatened good old Ma Perkins. Paul Reimer, of course, was great. He wrote Vic and Sade, which was different. Vic and Sade didn't have any regulars on it, and that was like Ring Lardner, great humor. That was a freak show. I mean, it didn't fit in the daytime schedule, but had a very loyal audience. It was very sophisticated in a Midwestern way and was very funny. But the other shows were traditional soap operas, and I was in a good number of them. Erna Phillips was the queen of soap operas. She wrote a great many of them, and I appeared a number of hers. But Ma Perkins, the first one, written by a Chicago graduate, Orrin Tovrov. But Ma Perkins was about a woman who owned a lumber yard, the mother and the daughter and son-in-law, good hard-working people. Every now and then these villains would come in. So I appeared on that a number of times. I always get killed, of course. Every time you get killed, you're out of a job. And so I'm the one who used to say, get in there. Get in there. You're generally a Chicago gangster. And I always had the same voice I got right now. I was sort of a Jimmy Cagney, Edward G. Robinson guy.
Radio of the past was the primary national advertising medium. More than any magazines, radio was the way advertisers got their message out to everybody. And therefore, there was a lot more money pumped into production, attractive production. Radio was dominated by 3 or 4 networks. The entire American national radio scene was controlled by CBS, NBC, Blue and Red, and later ABC, and the Mutual Network. That isn't the case today. Today there are 20, 30, not 20, maybe 10 times more stations than there were back in the golden age. There are thousands of stations now, low wattage, high wattage, college stations, and FM stations galore. Today the advertising is almost totally local. Even the national products only have spot ads where they'll drop them in the Chicago market or drop them into the Phoenix market or whatever. We don't have a national radio network anymore, even though it calls itself the ABC Radio Networks, plural. All it is they provide a little 5-minute political commentary and news on the hour to a local station which is otherwise totally formatted by the local personality or the local management. Radio today is not as important as it was. It's important, it plays an important role, but it's primarily music, sports, and news and talk. It is not a medium of mass entertainment in the sense of storytelling, in the sense of everybody tuning in, as they did the Jack Benny program, for instance, to a certain evening and listening to religiously.
The word disc jockey wasn't used back in those days. It was for a small station, a foreign language station, WGES, and I did something called Before the Wax Museum, which is my first, long-running disc jockey show. I would do something on Saturdays called The Weekend Reporter on this foreign language station. Had an audience of 5 people. And I would say Louis Armstrong's in town, play Louis Armstrong record and talk about that, or the opera. And I said, well, this reminds me of Claudia Mucci, a great opera singer I once heard, doing an aria from Traviata. And so it would be a combination of stuff. That program was the seed of one just after I came back from the war, some couple of years later, the Wax Museum on WENR, which is now WLS. Part of it was called the Blue Network of NBC. It was split up. That's when ABC came into being. And I was on WENR Sunday nights. But the program did stuff I liked, which could be a jazz piece, a blues piece, folk music. For the first time, Burl Ives was heard on radio, Woody Guthrie. Well, they were heard live on CBS first time on recordings. I would play them, or play opera, and I would do a version of the opera, a sort of a mug version. And at the same time, Dave Garroway was on with the 1160 Club doing jazz at night. For those younger people, Dave Garroway was a very popular jazz disc jockey in Chicago who became the first host of the Today Show in the early days of television. And TV came into being, and we'll come to what I'm doing now on radio. There was a TV moment, and Chicago was the center of what was called TV Chicago Style. Dave Garroway's show, Garroway at Large, Kukla Farinali, of course, with the genius Bert Hillstrom, and Stud's Place, when I was in, which all 3 had something in common. They were improvised, they had an air of spontaneity all alive. And then I got in trouble. It was Joe McCarthy days, and I wouldn't apologize for things I said. And so I got bounced, and I was bounced for quite a while. And then one day I heard a radio station called WFMT, the station I'm on now, have been for 40 years. And I heard the voice of Woody Guthrie on a recording, and no one played Woody in Chicago except me. So I said, I want to join you. And they said, we haven't got any money, we're broke. And I said, well, I am too, so we're even. That's how it began in 1952, and I've been here ever since.
Radio innovated what radio invented, and yet today, especially with young people, radio is a secondary medium to the video medium, and they don't realize the correlation. They don't realize that television started in radio. Those programs came from radio. In terms of the program itself, extraordinary stuff. Extraordinary stuff. And here again, and that's what this museum is about. It's to bring a whole new generation of people in and say to them, you know, there was an incredible art form in radio. There was extraordinary programming genres in radio. There was high theater. There was magnificent writing. And in fact, some of the great literary figures wrote for radio. Arthur Miller, Stephen Vincent Benet, Pearl S. Buck, and Archibald MacLeish, and on and on and on. And then radio engendered their own artists, like Norman Corwin, the poet laureate of radio, whose radio writings were so good, they made the conversion into printed form and sold tens and tens and thousands of books. And it was originally written for radio. And so it was an extraordinary time. A time that deserves to be remembered, a time that deserves to be elevated. There are 1,200 or more published radio poems and dramas and books that languish on bookstore shelves across America, have been lost since the 40s and 50s. It's a canon of literature that has been forgotten and shouldn't be. Right now, believe it or not, we're in the museum. It certainly, I think, gives the viewer the impression that we're at a television station on the news set, but this is part of the museum. This is an actual news set. There is a live radio broadcast studio not too far from here, where live broadcasts emanate a couple of times a week. And there is room for a studio audience and a fully equipped radio studio that beams signals out throughout the entire Chicago area. When you walk through the radio exhibit area, you are given a chronology of events since the advent of radio broadcasting all the way back to the 1920s. It is interactive. Eventually, when the new exhibit area is radio exhibit area is completed, you'll be able to dial up your favorite performers from the past and hear segments of their broadcast. There's Jack Benny's Vault. There's Fibber McGee and Molly's Closet. Things come falling out on you. There are numerous vintage radio receivers dating back to the earliest bread box receivers, to the cathedral sets, right up to the console sets, table models, and whatnot. So it's just a lot of fun, and it's accessible, and you are there.
The difference between radio and television is that radio calls more upon the imagination of the listener, and the key word is imagination of the listener, than TV calls upon the imagination of the viewer. The difference is TV, you see it as well as hear it. A good example why radio is more challenging. Dylan Thomas wrote a wonderful radio, a verse drama called Under Milkwood. It's the story of a Welsh village. It's become put in play form. Story of a Welsh village, and the people live in it from morning to night. That's it. And you hear it on the radio. It was recorded, you see. You hear it on the radio, and you imagine what that village is like. You imagine what that girl, that loose girl of the town, Polly Garter, is right. You imagine what that blind sea captain is like. But then you see it on TV, and I did see it on TV, and it was a marvelous production. I mean, it was a very good theater company doing it, but it wasn't my Polly Garter. It wasn't my Captain Cat, the blind sea captain. It wasn't my Welsh village. That's the difference. See, you imagine something more in radio than you imagine when you watch TV. So that's more spoon-fed to you, even the very few good programs on it. Well, there's a danger of romanticizing radio in the past, too. In substance, there wasn't much difference between radio and TV, except for one thing: the form, the attention span. Today, you know, the power of TV commercially is so strong that we think in terms of what's in between the commercials, not as and so you have 10 seconds. You know, for even the best of anchor people says, you got 15 seconds left. What is your philosophy of life, you know, before we go into the end of the show? There used to be an old burlesque skit years ago. I'd go to burlesque as a kid for sociological reasons. You go to burlesque and they had comics, as well as the striptease artists. The comics were first banana, second banana. And they wear baggy pants, and there was a straight man. And they often do it in dialect. And the very most straightening was something called Dutch dialect, which is a comic, German and Dutch. And the guy would say, what? To the first banana would say to the second banana, what is your philosophy of life? You've got 10 seconds left to live. What is your philosophy? And the guy would say, get all whatever it is you can while you're alive. You know, audience would howl. And then, but today you have the same anchor man who's the first banana saying, in a sense, what's your philosophy? You got 15 seconds. Nobody's laughing.
Doing Annie, or whatever else I might have done all those years, was a great experience. But being a child, in retrospect, I feel that this was, I missed a lot as a kid.
After Welcome Travelers went off the air, I did personal appearances all over the United States, and I was appearing in El Dorado, Arkansas. And this guy came up and he had a little letter from Barnes Carruthers, the booking agency, and it said, this introduces so-and-so, he's extra added to your show. And I said, you open the show. So we did the matinee, and he absolutely killed them. And after the matinee, he came up and he said, "Mr. Bartlett," he said, "where do you want me tonight?" I said, "You better close the show, Elvis." And it was Elvis Presley before he met Colonel Parker. You were asking why I went to the Dells. We had a road show. We played our first engagement in Madison, and our second engagement was a weekend at the Dells. And the people with the Chamber of Commerce, the Helen family and the Olson family, he ended up as ambassador to the Bahamas. He was frequently lieutenant governor of the state. They suggested that I open a permanent show at the Dells, which we did, and that was 40 years ago.
I would think the thing that will probably stand out about radio in 1990 are the talk shows. Maybe the Shockmeisters, which maybe 50 years from now will not seem shocking at all. But I think what will kind of be characteristic of radio, looking back 50 years, will be the technological changes that we're on the threshold of right now. Digital audio broadcasting, DAB, really, and maybe the word threatens is too strong, but it is very likely going to eliminate amplitude modulation and frequency modulation as we know it. Having written a book called The Broadcast Century, we in that book felt it was important to frame the 20th century as the broadcast century, because we don't believe that the broadcasting as we have known it will exist in the same form. Digital audio broadcasting will give parity to AM and FM, and it will be a different medium altogether, not so much in its content and programming, but in its technology. We go from analog to digital. And so I think when people look back and 50 years from now and think of radio, they'll think that it was an analog form of broadcasting, which I think from their perspective will almost be the equivalent of the gramophone.
You see, there is not very much that's original on radio today. Now everybody's going to scream at me and say, well, this guy's original, that guy's original, and the next one is original. But a lot of people are doing the same kind of thing. And I don't know whether this is a golden age or not, the 90s, if there's anything golden about radio in the 90s. If there is anything original on radio today, a lot of it is the public radio, some of those kinds of things. There are some comedy people on radio today. They started out as disc jockeys, and then they have become personalities, and they are doing some original things. And for some people, that may make up a golden age of radio, probably only because 10 years from now, it's likely that some of those people will be doing other things and not on radio. And people who are listening today in their late teens and in their 20s will miss those people and say, gee, remember how great it was back in the 90s when we used to listen to this person or to that person. A real golden age of radio is where there's a golden age of anything, is the original stuff that's coming, that's being produced. So much of radio today is music that's not original to radio. I mean, they're records and CDs, and they're playing them on the radio. So the only personality that can be, the only thing different about it can be the personality, the person who has a different way of presenting those recordings.
A major event took place in 1936 when the Lux Radio Theater, which had been produced for a couple of years in New York City, doing plays, when it moved in 1936 to Los Angeles and set up operation there under C.B. DeMille. The Lux Radio Theater we all fondly remember as a show which would take movies, bring the actual stars in many cases on the air to do cut-down radio dramatizations of major feature films. Out in Hollywood, there was all this personnel out there that could be exploited. You see this big shift, and part of it was Chicago radio personalities who left Chicago and would go to the West Coast because that's where the work was. They were wonderful actors, but the work just wasn't here anymore because the networks had decided to exploit the pool of personality talent that was there in Hollywood. And so you begin to see, by 1939, Fibber McGee and Molly leaves Chicago, goes to the West Coast for production. And Lum and Abner leaves Chicago, goes to the West Coast for production. A few would stay on, but not that many as to make an imprint nationally. And really by the mid-1940s, Chicago is increasingly becoming a town where the local production is locally oriented only. It is not national programming that comes out of here as much anymore as it did in the past. It comes out of Hollywood and it comes out of New York. And eventually, of course, to carry the story forward, when television comes along, Hollywood eventually kills New York City. And now almost all of our television comes out of New York, out of Los Angeles, or because of cost recently, out of Canada.
Jimmy Fiddler, the gossip column of Hollywood, used to say, memories that bless and burn. And this is when I was in the soap opera called Betty and Bob in Chicago. And I was a gangster, of course. And I was threatening the mother of Betty, played by a very elegant-looking actress with silver hair named Edie Davis. And these were forgettable programs. Her acting was horrible, as was mine, as was the script. But 50 years later, and election night 1980, on the TV screen we see President Ronald Reagan elect and the new First Lady Nancy Reagan, reference made to her mother, the mother-in-law of the president, Edie Davis. And that's the actress I was threatening on that soap opera 50 years ago, and that's when I had a revelation. I was caught on the road to Damascus, struck by a blinding light. And that revelation is, you can no longer tell where soap opera leaves off and life begins.
trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, What a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.